choice. They would be designed at the state level. They would be able to not just go to private schools. That said, we think that parents and families have a say in which are the effective schools in their communities. We think that they vote with their feet, or we would like them to be able to vote with their feet and be able to have the resources that are necessary to have scholarships available and to be able to make those decisions for themselves. That's a vision difference that we believe is reflected in this budget, in that we want parents and families and local communities to have more of a say in how their children are educated than the federal government doing that.
I think that is a significant philosophical difference, to elevate one form of education with a tax credit that'll.
Thank you. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Vogt. I assume in your job, Mr. Vogt, you receive a salary?
I do.
Okay. And your family has a fixed amount of income every year?
We do.
Okay. How long would your family last financially if every month you just charged more and more to your credit cards and paid the minimum?
We would face ruin financially, because at some point people would start to collect on what we would owe them. Yeah. And we would not be able to pay those bills, and they would come asking for our house.
Well, I mean, at some point, the amount of interest that you would be paying on the credit card would take up most of your disposable income, would it not?
It would.
Yeah. The federal government's kind of in that shape right now, aren't we?
We are.
Yeah, I saw a statistic the other day that we borrow $1 million a minute, $1.4 billion a day. Since we've been talking, we just borrowed $2 million to run this place. I want to thank you for trying to save taxpayer money. We have a legislative auditor in Louisiana who goes in and does an audit of all of the state programs. Our auditor did an audit of our Medicaid program. I'll read you the incomes of some of the people on Medicaid in Louisiana that he found. Recipient number 1 on Medicaid makes $155,840. Recipient number 3 makes $311,069. Here's an oldie but a goodie. Recipient 13 makes $390,968. Recipient number 8 makes $124,227. You know what happened to those people? Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. And you're a mean old man for trying to save taxpayer money. Do you believe that there is a single, solitary, fair-minded person in America who didn't just parachute in from another planet, who doesn't believe there is waste in the federal budget?
I have yet to meet one of the average day Americans.
And it's their money. I mean, you can laugh if you want, but it's inappropriate. I want to ask you about an article I read. Are you familiar with the expression "use it or lose it" spending?
I am.
What's that mean?
It's some would say a practice in which if you are at the end of the fiscal year and your spending is going to lapse, there's an incentive to spend that money so that you don't have it sitting as an unobligated balance that would then cause us, when we write budgets, to say you don't need additional money the next year.
Are you aware that at the end of last fiscal year, the Department of Defense at the last minute spent $4.6 million on lobster tail and crab?
I am aware of that report, and we're looking into it.
Somebody else bought a Wexford leather club chair for $9,241. Another agency spent $53,004 on China tableware. $673,471 on golf carts. I mean, that's a disgrace. That's just a disgrace. Do you know how much Americans spend of their hard-earned money in America every year trying to help people less fortunate than they are?
Pardon, what's your question, sir?
Do you know how much, sorry, I'm not being clear. Do you know how much Americans spend of their hard-earned money every year, tax dollars, to help people less fortunate than they are?
They are very generous. I don't have a specific figure.
Try $1 trillion. That's 12 zeros. So I just think people are mistaken when they suggest that if you're trying to save money, that somehow makes you a cold, heartless person. And I wanted to thank you for your efforts to try to help us save taxpayer dollars.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Whitehouse.
I guess it would kind of depend on what money you're trying to save before you could make that moral judgment. If you're trying to prevent a family from getting health insurance and at the same time trying to make sure that a big corporation doesn't pay any taxes at all, then I come down a little bit on the other side of Senator Kennedy, as much as I appreciate and share the concern about lobster tails and fancy china and golf carts. But I don't think we're here about lobster tails and fancy china and golf carts. Do you anticipate, Mr. Vogt, any knock-on economic effects from cutting 31% of the Army Corps budget, either generally or in the localities where projects would be ended or not funded?
We have not done an assessment specifically as it pertains to the Army Corps. That said, we
How
do
about
think
highways?
that infrastructure.
You proposed 22% cut to the highway discretionary budget. Have you done any estimates of what knock-on economic effect that would either have nationally or in the localities where major projects would be delayed, closed, or unfunded?
We believe that our economic growth numbers, which project 3% growth in the years ahead, they do reflect the administration's policies, including infrastructure investment. So when we talk about a $200 billion investment.
Yeah, I get that. That's like you're saying we put it all in there and we spit out this number at the end. What I'm asking you is there a number attributable to the 31% cut in Army Corps spending or the 22% cut in highway spending that you propose?
Again, I think the last figure that you talked about with regard to the year over year with the Department of Transportation needs some context. We had
I'm just asking a really simple question. Have you done any analysis to show what the knock-on economic effects are of cuts of that magnitude in those construction and infrastructure programs? And I don't know why that's such a difficult question to answer. Could you please give it another try?
From a line item perspective, we've not done a specific analysis as it pertains to the various reductions that you were referring to. That said, right, in totality of this budget and the infrastructure spendings that it calls for, we do think that we're investing in infrastructure, and we do think it'll lead to economic growth.
I would love to have you and candidate Trump debate this infrastructure number, because I think candidate Trump would tear you to pieces over your infrastructure investment, considering the promises that he made on the campaign. This was one of many that have evaporated since then. Let me ask you about something else. Let me ask you about climate change. What do you anticipate the effects are of climate change with respect to Department of Defense bases, particularly bases located near sea level rise, coastal bases, Norfolk Naval Station and others like that I mentioned with Senator Kaine here, and operating costs?
We don't have any assumptions along those lines.
What do you propose in your budget regarding climate change with respect to domestic ports and infrastructure and needs through the Army Corps or other infrastructure development protecting our coastal ports and infrastructure?
We've analyzed our investments in ports along the seaboard as something that's based on the need in those areas. We have not done it on the basis of climate change.
How about the federal flood insurance program? Have you baked in any estimates to your flood insurance program liability numbers that relate to climate change and sea level rise?
We have not.
And with respect to FEMA disaster dollars, have you baked into your, I know that's a little bit, it tends to come in off budget because it comes in as emergency spending. I don't know if you've incorporated that in your numbers. Let me ask you that question first.
We have not.
So it's not in there at all? Emergency spending is not in there at all?
No, there is emergency spending for that's reflected in this budget. We continue to make the request
even though
of what's
it's
necessary.
so-called off budget here in Congress, you have emergency spending in the president's proposed budget.
We do. From a standpoint
and
of
it incorporates nothing with respect to sea level rise and climate change.
Correct. Our emergency spending from our perspective is
up.
not off budget.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Vogt. Wasteful spending would be a bad thing regardless of what federal agency it was in, right?
Yes.
Okay. And isn't it true that the Defense Department has been the major federal department that for years couldn't pass an audit or even complete an audit? Isn't that true?
Not until this administration.
No, but in past years, isn't that true?
They have not done the audit as required by Congress.
That's right. And this year they did an audit, but they didn't pass the audit, right?
They've completed the audit.
They completed the audit. They didn't pass the audit, right? They realized they had a lot of work to do to figure out where
they did realize they have a lot of work to do.
And that didn't stop you from putting more money into defense, did it?
It did not.
Right. So obviously we want to root out wasteful spending wherever it is, no matter what agency. But just because there's an increase in a budget doesn't mean that everything else in that budget is somehow wasteful. I also was interested in your response to Senator Stabenow. You said that the reasons for cuts to programs was they were, quote, not effective. Is that right?
With regard to which one?
Because they were not effective. I thought you said that in
I did
block,
say that.
right?
I was trying to remember what you were referencing.
Not effective. Is NIH investment, is that an effective investment for the taxpayer?
We do think that NIH is an effective investment. As a father of a child that has cystic fibrosis, many of the life-saving drugs that she benefits from have been developed based on research at NIH.
Right.
I will also tell you that the levels that we are providing NIH resources at are above the fiscal year 17 levels. And that
is true, Mr. Vogt, and that was a decision made by Congress. We actually increased the Trump administration's proposal. You've cut it. I just hope you got to get your story straight with the agency heads, because I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and when we ask them about why programs were cut, they usually don't say it's because they were ineffective. They usually say that OMB told us we had to make trade-offs. That's the reason they give us. And I'm going to follow up on Senator Stabenow's question. All these programs that are cut because you say they're ineffective, I'd like the backup as well, where there's a finding of ineffectiveness. Now, I have a question on the Department of Transportation. I see that you cut the Department of Transportation budget by about $5 billion for 2020. That includes cuts to the capital investment, grants. Those are a primary source of federal assistance to transit programs, cutting other capital projects within the Department of Transportation. It's $5 billion this year. Since we don't have the tables yet for the out years, and since you're reducing the caps in the out years for non-defense domestic spending, can you tell us, is it going to be more than $5 billion a year cut for the Department of Transportation in those out years?
Again, I think it's important to provide context for the Department of Transportation's funding level. As you know, our first two budgets had very different levels in terms of what we proposed. We proposed, as a result of Congress saying we're going to spend more, we're going to have a higher non-defense cap level, we wanted a significant amount of that to go towards infrastructure to reflect our shared priorities on that front. We asked for a huge investment to be put forward as it pertains to infrastructure in the discretionary side.
Yeah.
That is why we don't go all the way. When we show a reduction, we're saying we're still above the fiscal year 17
but you're okay. I appreciate the commentary, but you are cutting by $5 billion in the Department of Transportation. I asked you if that cut went right through the 10 years of your budget. I suspect it does. We don't have them yet. Usually when we have a budget hearing, we actually get the full budget. So that would be $50 billion minimum. And to pick up on what Senator Enzi pointed out, when you look at what you did with respect to the Highway Trust Fund, you essentially cut it by $146 billion. Now you say you're just following current law, right?
Right.
Now you didn't follow current law when in your baseline when it comes to extending the tax cuts for wealthy people, did you?
No, we had a proposal.
No, you had a proposal there. You had a policy proposal there, and you could have done the same exact thing when it came to transportation funding. So the reality is when you look at your policy proposals, you're cutting $146 billion under the Highway Trust Fund. You're cutting about $50 billion at least in the Department of Transportation. And then you come up and say you got a $200 billion infrastructure plan because the president says it's a priority. I net this out. It looks like you're underwater. It looks like it's net under 200. At best, you're even in terms of your infrastructure investments. When you add in the cuts to water infrastructure and your rural infrastructure programs, you're not even close. So how can you say this is a priority for the president, then come out with a budget that on net cuts infrastructure?
Senator, we think that we've put forward a budget that includes significant investments.
You put it in one pocket, and then with the other hand, you take it away. So it's a great shell game. But the reality is, on net, your budget is cutting infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, can I have one question on federal employees? All right, are we going to have a second round for those of us who are sticking around? I appreciate it. So on federal employees, quick question, because it's not clear here. Your budget, as I see it, projects a 2.3% increase in the CPI, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you include a cost of living pay increase for civilian federal employees?
We don't, but we have a proposal in the budget to ensure that performance is rewarded at federal agencies so that high performance can get raises, can be retained. We think it's an important aspect of this budget because when we look at the federal employee surveys that come in, and only about 25% of workers think that their pay is in any way based on performance. And then we also look at the fact that overall federal employees receive more compensation than their private sector counterparts.
As you know, Mr. Vogt, that is true for some sectors of federal employees. That's not true for lower wage federal employees, is it? Do you know what the starting wage for a TSA employee is?
Off the top of my head, no.
It's $32,000. You think that does that sound way out of whack to you?
There is certainly a universe of individuals where are underpaid and those who are overpaid.
And I appreciate that, but for those that are underpaid, you're not giving them even a cost of living increase. In fact, you're cutting. This is my last question. You're effectively cutting their pay, and here's why. You have a proposal in here to increase the contribution that every federal employee has to give to their pension without increasing their pension by 1 penny. Isn't that true?
We do have a proposal to balance what the employee pays along with what the agency pays to be able to save money.
You're asking the employees, all of them put in more, right?
They will have to put in more.
And they're not getting a penny more in pension, right? Isn't that right?
Not necessarily, Senator, because they can be eligible for the retention.
For the money they put in, they're not getting any additional money.
True, but in terms of
so when you're taking money out of a current paycheck and not providing any increased retirement benefit, that's a pay cut, pure and simple.
If they're high performers, they can be eligible for bonuses and incentive payments.
But if you're a $32,000 a year starting TSA employee, you're getting a pay cut. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you used up the second turn as well. Senator Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vogt, when your budget or the president's budget proposes $1.5 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and $845 billion cuts to Medicare, when you propose that, you obviously studied how many people would die as a result of lack of access to health care. What conclusion did you reach? How many thousands of people do you think will die because of massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid?
Senator, those numbers that you cited are not accurate. We do not cut Medicare by $850 billion. what that doesn't account for is the fact that we take things outside of Medicare, for such as uncompensated care, to non-Medicare beneficiaries. We move that outside of Medicare. We're going to still spend money on uncompensated care for non-Medicare beneficiaries, but when you adjust for the things where we put it back in other parts of the budget, there is no cut at all, because Medicare is going up each and every year, and also it's $517 in savings instead of the number that you cited. And there's a
well, it's going up every year in nominal dollars. I understand that, but you will concede that healthcare inflation is higher than general inflation. So if you're not even keeping up with healthcare inflation, it in fact is a real healthcare cut. I mentioned earlier the very alarming concern that hospitals have about the devastation these cuts will do for senior citizens. And when you cut $1.5 trillion, you're also not including in your calculations the fact that there are more people who will be in the Medicare program. I suspect Medicaid, despite the administration's effort, will continue to expand. But you did not answer my question. There are studies out there which suggest that many thousands of Americans die every single year because they don't get to a doctor when they should. Did you, in your calculations about massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, come up with any numbers as to how many Americans will die or maybe get sicker because they don't have the health care that they need? We
don't think any of those scenarios will result. In fact, we look at the current situation and we look at a tragic scenario where a young boy in 2007, 2008, DeMonte Driver, died because of the fact that he had a toothache because of the wait lines within Medicaid. And we say that's a fundamentally broken system. We want a different system. We want states to have more control over
with less money. You want to throw, look, this president tried to throw millions of people off of Medicaid. Giving a block grant to a state with less money means massive cuts in Medicaid. Let's be honest about what you're doing. Let me ask you this question. President Trump campaigned about not cutting Medicare, not cutting Medicaid, and he's making massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. What should the American people think about that?
This budget's title is Promises Kept, Taxpayers First, and for a specific reason. The president kept his promises to the American people in this budget. We do not cut Medicare, we do not cut Social Security, and we do not cut Medicaid.
All right, I would respectfully suggest that is a dishonest answer. I think that's absolutely inaccurate. It is unfactual. And you will have to explain to somebody, not to me, why the hospitals in this country are scared to death about the impact that your budget and President Trump's budget will have on them. Please tell me why it is a good idea to extend tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country who are already doing phenomenally well, and then cut back on the ability of kids to get a college education or senior citizens in this country to stay warm in the wintertime. What is your logic about that one?
We think it's important that families be able to keep more of what is their own money.
And what percentage,
difference
the tax breaks that you guys passed last year, 83% of those benefits went to the top 1%. In fact, millions of Americans pay more in taxes. So what you are doing here is giving tax breaks to the wealthiest people who are doing phenomenally well. Then you're cutting back on education, making it harder for kids to get a college education. You're cutting back on nutrition programs. Do you really not have a conscience? Do you know that people all over this country, children, seniors...
We're not cutting back on nutrition programs.
Oh, you're not cutting back on the SNAP program?
We have reforms in the SNAP.
Oh, reforms.
Work requirement of a harvest box. We're not...
How much are you cutting back on these programs?
We have about $200 billion in savings from those people.
Savings, I see. See, to listen to these hearings, fellow Americans, you need to get a dictionary. Savings means cuts. Reform means massive cuts. Let's be clear what this budget is. This is a budget that benefits wealthy campaign contributors. This is a budget that goes to war against the working families of this country. This really is, in fact, a disgraceful budget, and I'm happy to say that there are going to be very few people, even Republicans, who will vote for this terrible budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witness for being here to testify. Again, I would mention that You have to go through this even though we just consider a president's budget to be suggestions. We hold the purse strings. We have to make the decisions. And your input has been helpful, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There's an opportunity for those senators that were at other places to submit questions that I hope you will answer promptly. They have to have them in by tomorrow night at 5 p.m. And so any additional questions can be submitted. Thank you. Adjourn. Oh,